All right, thanks everybody. Here we go.
Welcome to today's webinar, What Americans Think About Philanthropy and Nonprofits, hosted by the Council on Foundations in partnership with the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. We will begin shortly. For any technical issues, please submit a message through the chat at the bottom of your screen or email us at marleyclayton@cof.org, an email address we will place in the chat. For automated live transcript, please click on the button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles or View Full Transcript. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all participants and posted on our website as a resource. Finally, if you have any comments, please use the chat feature. Kristen Scott Kennedy, the Council's Vice President, Strategy and Organizational Effectiveness and Chief of Staff, will be moderating today's discussion. Kristen?
Thanks so much, Wendy, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're really pleased to have you here. So the question that we were faced with today, what do Americans think about philanthropy and nonprofits, is one that we often sit with here at the Council on Foundations. We are an organization dedicated to supporting philanthropy to be trusted partners in advancing the greater good. So at our core, we believe that philanthropic organizations in partnership with nonprofits and community can support the equitable, systemic, and scalable solutions that ensure all people and the planet can thrive. But we also know that often the conversations we have in philanthropy don't translate to the general public, even those who may access services from nonprofits or receive philanthropic support. At the end of 2022, Independent Sector's Health of the Nonprofit Sector showed that US nonprofits contributed $1.5 trillion to the US economy in the last quarter of the year and made up 6.5% of the US workforce. And yet, as Lilly Family School of Philanthropy research shows, the American public lacks deep knowledge about the functioning of the sector and is generally unaware of the things that many of us spend much of our time thinking and talking about. And research by the Council this year has found that even amongst ourselves, we don't always tell good stories about philanthropy. Earlier this year, the Council partnered with the Center for Public Interest Communications to conduct a landscape scan that takes stock of the national conversation about philanthropy. And that scan, which included thousands of pages of news and opinion articles, polling, and other messaging, surfaced a major finding. There is no common messaging about the sector and what it does. So people tend to use stories that feed into a few deep messages. And these stories tend to focus on a distrust of wealth, an unease with public-funded, private-funded public problem solving, or a single hero saving the day. So when we consider that these are the most prominent narratives about philanthropy, it's no wonder that reports like the one we're discussing today show that even though Americans have a broadly favorable impression of charitable giving and nonprofit organizations, we continue to see declining public trust, concerns about transparency and accountability, and an overall decline in charitable giving. And that leaves us with some important questions, namely, what should we make of these findings and what can we do about it? So today I'm joined by a terrific panel who will help us grapple with these questions. Dr. Una Osili is the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. Allison Grayson is the Director of Policy Development and Analysis at Independent Sector. And John Tyler is the General Counsel, Secretary, and Chief Ethics Officer Legal at the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation. So to get us started, I'd love to pass it over to Dr. Osili, and I'd love to have you kick us off by sharing an overview of the key findings from your research.
Thank you very much to our colleagues at the Council for hosting this very exciting discussion. Of course, thank you to all of you who've joined us from all over the country, different time zones, different geographies, and also to my colleagues who will join the panel shortly. I'd like to just bring you into this conversation, share a little bit about the research, some of the key findings, and then open it up for discussion. But I encourage you throughout our presentation, this short presentation, to send in your questions and your comments. We'd love to hear them throughout the webinar. So let me take you back to this particular research project, what Americans think about philanthropy, how we got to this research question, and what our key findings were. First, a bit of background. All of us know that our nation faces several challenges. We've had an unprecedented global pandemic, one that really surpasses anyone's expectations. Many of us have not lived through a crisis of this proportion. Continuing economic anxieties and uncertainties that we're all facing, as well as a racial and social justice movement. All of these have taken place in the last 3 years. But even beyond those three big shocks that our societies are grappling with, our communities are grappling with, we know that the United States is also facing significant economic, demographic, and political shifts. On the demographic side, we have an aging population, but also new cohorts, younger Americans that are exerting their economic, their social, and political influence. And so I think nonprofits as well as philanthropy is dealing with all of those changes, and the data and the research grapples with that as well. But let me also broaden the lens and say that we undertook this project because we also understood and recognized that philanthropy plays a vital role in solving problems in American communities around the country, whether in urban or rural areas, Midwest, on the East Coast or the West Coast. There is a common thread. Philanthropy and the nonprofit sector have been vital to providing public goods, but also providing funding to catalyze solutions to important and seemingly intractable problems, and also providing funding for religious organizations and many other important parts of our civil society. Now, you heard the numbers about philanthropy and the nonprofit sector, but let me just put this in perspective. In the last few years, we've seen, despite these challenges, we've seen tremendous generosity, with giving reaching a new record according to Giving USA last year of $480 billion. But alongside the growth and expansion in generosity, we've also been tracking some trends that I think should be of concern to all of us and raise concerns about the health and vitality of the sector going forward, but also bring to light a lot of the equity concerns that have been part of the discussion for some time. So specifically at the Lilly Family School, we've been tracking the number of American donors, the fraction of American households that participate in philanthropy. And we noted that at the beginning of the 21st century, 2/3 of American households gave to charitable organizations. According to our latest data collected before the COVID pandemic, less than half of Americans were giving to charitable 501c3 organizations. So that data point has certainly been of concern. And alongside our tracking of giving data, we've also noted declining trust in institutions broadly, including philanthropy and nonprofits. All of this taken together raises questions about philanthropy and the nonprofit sector's role as we seek to, as several folks have already noted, play a role in continuing to provide public goods and address societal challenges. The questions remain: how will nonprofits and philanthropy engage donors, engage the public, engage stakeholders as they seek to do their work, whether it's in disaster relief, arts and culture, education, healthcare, and many other spheres. So in today's report, there's so much to share, but we're going to distill all of the findings just to 3 areas. The first one, and probably foremost on everyone's mind, is what does the data tell us about how Americans trust the nonprofit sector? What do we know about public confidence in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector? How has it shifted, especially in the light of the COVID pandemic and many other shifts that we've discussed? In addition to sharing the data, I will also touch on the implications of these findings and focus in on what it means for funders and foundations, and specifically, what can all of these different stakeholders do to build greater knowledge and greater confidence in the sector. So there are some data people that are joining, so I should just mention that we developed an original survey instrument. I won't spend too much time on the methodology, but we did work with an excellent council of advisors, an advisory council on the survey instrument, and then collected the data using a nationally representative panel of American households and worked in partnership with the Knowledge Panel. So this is an opportunity to thank all of our advisory council members. And this survey was fielded in 2022, and the final sample size was over 1,000. So a very significant data collection effort, which yielded a diverse sample of American households. So just to remind you, in terms of key takeaways, we learned that I'll just summarize some of the key findings that we did not find, in fact, that Americans understand the philanthropic sector or the nonprofit sector. The survey revealed broadly that there is a gap in the public's knowledge and understanding. We also saw that the general public is not as aware of what we might call inside philanthropy and nonprofit sector conversations, and there's a need to broaden some of those conversations. And then finally, when we think about the future of the sector and where the work needs to be done, there is certainly a need to build trust with the general public, but also to build a culture and to change the narrative so that the sector can be seen as more transparent and inclusive. So those are just some key highlights. And then now I'm going to actually share the data on which the study is based. So we divided our study into several components. And this is also a chance to thank my colleagues here at the Lilly Family School who contributed to this work, so many of them, including Dr. Chelsea Clark, who led this project. So the first question that we really took on is that we live in a time where definitions are changing. Even our own understanding of philanthropy is changing. In particular, over the last few years, we've seen an expansion in the notion of philanthropy, where in the past, perhaps, there has been this notion of giving money as a central part of philanthropy, but increasingly, we're thinking not just about the 3 T's, giving time, talent, and treasure, but broadening our lenses to include giving testimony, sharing your stories and your voice, using your platform to elevate the causes that matter to you, and then giving ties, sharing your network with the causes that you care about and the organizations that matter to you. At this school, at the Lilly Family School, we have a number of scholars that are working on broadening the understanding and ways that we think about philanthropy. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Tyrone Friedman, has done some path-breaking work in this topic, looking specifically at giving by African Americans and the various ways that they have used their time, their talent, their treasures, but also their testimony, their voice to advance causes that were important to their communities. What we note here is, although there has been an increasingly broad way of looking at philanthropy beyond just giving money, increasingly, we do see that for the most part, Americans are still less aware of the notion of ties and testimony as part of the overall definition of philanthropy. So although we talk about the 5 T's quite a bit here at the school and in philanthropy more broadly, the general public still has a relatively, you could say, narrow understanding. However, I just want to also stress that we see important differences by age. Younger Americans are much more attuned to the notion of a broader definition of philanthropy. And we also note that women and other diverse groups tend to approach philanthropy with a much broader lens. So turning our attention to the second set of questions that we set out to answer, which center on trust. For a long time, I would say, certainly since I've been involved in the philanthropic sector for more than 3 decades, we have been tracking trust in institutions more broadly. And there is extensive data from many different studies, including a study conducted by independent sector, but also the general social surveys housed at the University of Chicago show that trust in American institutions has been declining. And since the 1970s, when that data was first collected, what's very striking about the overall trends is that younger Americans have much lower levels of trust in institutions overall. Now, what we set out to do in this project was also focus in on not just the notion that the public trusts or doesn't trust institutions, but to understand and unpack the way that the public relates to specific types of institutions within the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. And what we note overall, and here's the really good news for all of you who are joining today, the nonprofit sector is certainly viewed with much higher degree of favorability than other institutions. In particular, nearly 40% trust nonprofit organizations to do generally what is right. And you can see that in contrast, state and local government, the federal government, even the judiciary and large corporations rank very low on trust. So that is the good news. I think that shows that at least in a relative sense, nonprofit organizations are performing quite well. However, I should note that we should also view these results through another prism and lens, and that's to recognize that we have a lot of work to do to start to rebuild in our trust in institutions, and especially when we look at the data where younger Americans have more distrust. And I think alongside this data is also to keep in mind that it is quite a challenge to rebuild that trust. It's much easier to retain than to rebuild. And so in the data, we certainly see that nonprofit organizations are doing quite well, but there's quite a lot to do to, I think, get these numbers even to a 50% mark, especially when we look at the overall trends and what has been happening over time. Now, one way to gauge whether the general public is aware of overall trends in the philanthropic sector is to pick very specific trends that we think are quite well known, but just to ask, are people aware of these trends? And one of these data points that we actually included in the survey for the first time is to ask, as you can see, a representative sample of Americans, what they know about overall charitable giving trends. This finding wasn't a surprise to me. So if I had to say what was surprising to me, this was, in general, most households, most individuals are not aware of the general trends in philanthropy. While it's been well documented that the percentage of Americans who give has declined over time, as you can see, the bulk of the sample said it either increased or stayed the same, and it was less than 40% that actually identified the correct direction here, which is that charitable giving participation rates have actually declined. Now, this is I'd say a related area of inquiry where we have spent time not just asking whether Americans have trust in institutions, but also to look at this through a knowledge lens. And here we ask the questions, how familiar with or how knowledgeable are you with specific institutions within philanthropy? And we included a wide array of institutional forms. And here we wanted to capture the fact that philanthropy has become more complex, more sophisticated. There's been quite a bit of innovation. There is also a wide variety of entities that are being used within the philanthropic sector. So in the last few decades, we've seen the advent of and the, I'd say, diffusion of donor advice funds, limits LLCs as giving vehicles, but also the growth of giving circles, grassroots fundraising campaigns, crowdfunding in particular, where nearly 40% of Americans are giving via crowdfunding. So taken together, it is a much more complex philanthropic sector. And our goal was to shine a light on the extent to which individuals are familiar with these different vehicles. So here, I think there's a lot to take away from this very slide. And in particular, what we learned is that while overall, there is some familiarity with institutions, there's also quite a bit of variation. And what stood out to me is that community foundations are at the highest mark, with over 30% of individuals, respondents saying that they're familiar with the work of community foundations. There's a lot to learn from that, a lot to, I think, take away. Community foundations play a unique role in communities. They are proximate to the people they serve. And many community foundations also provide a great deal of contact with the communities that they serve and engagement with community and nonprofit organizations. So perhaps it's not a surprise, but I think there's a lot to learn from that. Here in Indiana, we have a community foundation in every county. And so this finding, I think, is a really strong encouragement to the work that community foundations have done to be proximate to the communities they serve. Now, I'm turning our attention now to a slightly related but also important slice of the data. And in addition to gauging trust, we also looked into awareness around specific policies, institutional forms, and questions that are often, we might say, insider critiques of the philanthropic sector. Over the last decade in particular, there have been many new questions that have arisen around how foundation assets should be governed and whether there is a need for reform around payout rates. Some of this, for those who have been paying attention, in the early 1970s, the Filer Commission had a very in-depth review of what was taking place within the philanthropic sector. The data actually here are also quite surprising. When it comes to knowledge, and here more specific knowledge of how the sector works, we find that most households are simply not aware of whether there is a payout rate, and quite a few answered incorrectly around this question. So when you think about knowledge gaps and information asymmetries, you could actually say that in general, Americans are not aware of the specific rules that govern foundations and a lot of other philanthropic institutions, not just foundations. Around the debate specifically around perpetuity and how foundations should operate, whether they should give their assets out in a spend down mode, sunset the foundations within a certain time frame, or have a perpetual model around giving. We find that the general public actually aligns very strongly with the idea of a perpetual model around philanthropy, which is surprising in the context of a lot of the debates taking place within philanthropy. And then finally, as we try to wrap up, there's a lot to share about what the challenges are. In addition to the knowledge gaps and the lack of trust that we've mentioned, one theme that is a through line in the study is that many American households are not aware of the services provided by nonprofits. The second finding that surprised me the most out of the study is that less than 5% of households that we surveyed said that they or someone they knew had received services from a nonprofit. There are a lot of reasons why the public may not be as aware of where the services come from or the extent to which the education, healthcare, arts and culture, or any number of services that they receive come from nonprofits has to do with perhaps the mixed model through which a lot of services are provided, with some government funding, with private funding, and certainly that may lead to some confusion. However, there's also the question that many nonprofits and philanthropy more broadly may not be as attuned to the need to engage and communicate with their stakeholders, with their public, and with households in their communities. Another challenge for the sector, I think, comes through in the differences we see by age specifically. The study, I think, raises an important but also a challenge for the sector ahead, which is how to engage with younger people, more diverse donors, and also to bridge the education divide. When we cut and slice the data by education, we find that households with a college degree, for example, are much more knowledgeable about how philanthropy and the nonprofit sector work. And then finally, we do have to situate this study in the environment that we're in today, where there is increased polarization, political polarization, but also other forms of fractionalization, as well as increasing economic uncertainty. What is very clear is that there is an opportunity here. Crowdfunding campaigns, I want to highlight that, are actually very well known, and most people understand how they work. The same thing with community foundations. And so here, I think we can learn a lot from the organizations that are performing well, in terms of how are they going about their work, and also what can other entities within the philanthropic sector do to perhaps engage more with the general public and share the work they do in a transparent way. So before we turn it over to the panel, I have shared a lot of key findings. I mentioned that the one that stuck with me was that less than 5% of respondents had actually received services from a nonprofit, or someone they knew had received services. That means that nonprofits in particular can do a lot more to build a sense of proximity with the communities they serve. I know that Brian Stevenson, a very well-known social justice leader, talks about the role that leaders can play, specifically proximate leaders. And that comes from engaging with the communities they serve. So too often, nonprofit organizations may not, can do a lot more to share their mission with their donors, with their communities, and with those that they partner with. In addition, today's world, I think expectations are high around transparency and accountability. We live in a data-rich world, and our stakeholders are used to accessing data in real time about nearly every topic. And nonprofits, I think this is an area where there's room for innovation. While there is a lot to celebrate in the fact that nonprofits are more trusted than other institutions, I think nonprofits can also take the lead in building cultures of inclusion. And this is especially true around communities. For foundations, and today we're very fortunate to have so many foundation leaders and those who work within foundations joining us today. There are a lot of lessons in this study just for the foundation community. Today, perhaps more so than ever, collaboration is really the way that the work is done. No single sector can solve the challenges that communities face. And there's also this question of how knowledgeable are grantees about the work that foundations do. Some funders have actually established a team within their organization that communicates with their grantees and others in the community. But I think beyond that, there's a need to connect with local communities and to build bridges with organizations at all different levels, grassroots organizations, as well as larger and more established organizations. And then finally, technology is a big piece of our lives today. Technology provides both a challenge for nonprofits and foundation, as well as an opportunity when we think about how to share stories, how to communicate, how to engage. I think there's a lot of promise, but also there are challenges associated with how technology can help bridge the gaps that we see today and help nonprofits and philanthropy serving institutions build a culture of inclusion. So I'll stop here and turn it back over to Kristen to help lead us to the next stage of our discussion today.
Great, thank you, Dr. Osili. And I'm pleased to welcome the rest of the panel into the conversation now and have us chat a little bit about what we make of these findings. And I'd love to start with a question actually for John. Which is, as we look at these results and hear from Una, we see that although Americans have a broadly favorable opinion of charitable giving and nonprofit, the sector is clearly facing challenges when it comes to how we're perceived and understood within the broader public sphere. And I'm wondering, what do we lose when the public doesn't understand who we are and what we do, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Una, and your team for this report, and thanks to everybody for being here and the opportunity to be part of this. To me, one of the most astounding statistics from the report is the 5.4% number, and that's only 5.4% of the respondents could identify an interaction that they or an immediate family member had with a nonprofit. And that's in the context of most hospitals are nonprofits. A lot of schools are nonprofits. Churches, synagogues, mosques are nonprofits, et cetera. And YMCAs, athletic teams, there's a lot of nonprofits that people interact with that they don't actually realize they're interacting with. And I think that lack of intentionality, that lack of understanding, on one hand, puts at risk that the sector gets taken for granted, and that it could always be there, always doing what it is. But that's just not the case. The sector needs support. These organizations, this involvement depends on people engaging with it, and we do better when they understand that they're engaging in the nonprofit sector. I think that Una, in her earlier remarks, I think the report early on talks about and lists some of the at high levels some of the really important roles that the charitable sector plays and provides service to our communities. And I'm speaking more from a U.S.-centric approach here. But notions of neighborhood engagement, notions of connectivity and belonging, whether that's at an individual level, given some of the studies that show a lack of belonging in the face of social media polarization, et cetera. The sector affords those types of opportunities for interaction. The sector is also a place for sort of counter-majoritarian thinking as well. So on one hand, it's very community-oriented, it's engagement-oriented, but it's also places for new ideas to come out, to be tested, to be developed and grown, or put away if there's not the appetite for them. And sometimes that appetite is going to be manifest through government picking up certain things. Sometimes it will be because there's actually a business idea that comes about. And sometimes it's just, the charitable sector as private enterprise, private people pursuing, public good together. And sometimes that means pushing back against popular opinion. And we need the flexibility to do that as neighbors, as a community, as a society. I think it's the sector brings both populist and counter-majoritarian together. And if we don't recognize that, we all end up worse off, I think.
Allison, what would you add?
To that, nothing. John covered all the bases. He was great.
Well, one thing that we know from this report, and I think from others, including work that independent sector has done, is that when people engage with nonprofits and philanthropy, they tend to view them more favorably. And John has alluded to that too in his remarks. And so, Allison, I know this is a focus area for independent sector and the work that you do. So can you talk about maybe some of the bright spots that you would point to when it comes to how philanthropy and nonprofits are engaging with and in community? And then maybe we'll hear from Una and John as well on that.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess the first bright spot that I want to highlight is the study done by Indiana University asked some questions that are similar to the trust research that independent sector has been fielding for the last 4 years. And a lot of the findings were replicated. And the reason why that's a bright spot is because it means we're really onto something as a sector in terms of what we can learn about trends that are happening. And we can use that information pretty reliably to start making some decisions. So I want to make sure I highlight just the first bright spot, which is, the research we're talking about today. Some of the engagement examples that we're seeing both in our data and then with some follow-up conversations, a big one is this concept around quality versus quantity of engagement. In a lot of our data, and just like this study, we found that religious institutions scored pretty high in terms of levels of trust, but also it wasn't just anyone who attended or engaged a religious institution. We measured frequency of engagement, and it was the frequency of engagement where they scored is much more trusting and significantly more trusting than people who just received services from nonprofit organizations. And so that led us to ask some questions around, well, what kind of interaction does somebody who frequently engages a religious institution have that's different than when you sort of passively receive services from a nonprofit? And that's where we got into like this hypothesis about quality over quantity, and also this concept that, you know, religious congregations are often very participatory. So it's not just a bunch of paid staff that are doing everything, but they actually bring their stakeholders into the institution, encourage them to volunteer, to engage in some decision-making processes. So that form of participation may provide more ownership in the direction of the mission and therefore foster greater levels of trust. But I think the thing that is really encouraging, which Kristen alluded to, is this idea that a positive experience with a single institution can create a halo effect that benefits the whole sector. So that's something we've been thinking about a lot in sort of replication going forward. And I know a lot of our talking points today are a little bit around philanthropy in particular and philanthropic institutions. Our data did find that people trusted nonprofits a little bit more, quite a bit more than they trusted philanthropy. But once we factored in that sort of familiarity and frequency of engagement, it all kind of evened out. And so what we're really seeing is people who engage with an institution a lot trust the institution, whether it's philanthropy or nonprofits. And so then we think about, as a sector, how do we design our community participation, our board engagement, our grant making processes, and what we fund in our grantees in terms of community engagement to maximize the quality of meaningful community engagement, right? Because it doesn't necessarily make sense for philanthropy to, for the whole sector, like perform the same levels of community engagement that their grantees do. So let's think about it from a systemic perspective, and how can we maximize how many people we're touching and making them feel like they're a part of the process. In a preparation conversation, John pointed out a really great point where he said, you know, bringing people in and making them feel a part of the process does not mean that the institution sort of abdicates their professional expertise or responsibility and turns it into a little bit like a popularity contest. So that's not what we're talking about. And in fact, it's very easy to throw out terms like in meaningful engagement or participatory governance. It's a lot harder to do it in a way that is really effective, that truly does protect democratic minorities, do it in a way where it's not just performative, where we kind of ask people what they think, but then we don't really listen, which there's data that shows if you do that, that is almost worse than if you didn't ask them at all. So I think for institutions like independent sector and council and foundations, one of the things we can do is to help work with the sector to make it easier, more accessible to do this kind of work. And we're still figuring it out. But that's where I would start as one place to highlight. And I'm sure John has other ideas.
Well, I want to give Una a chance to weigh in if she wants.
No, I think Allison has covered it very nicely. The one I'd say additional point I would just raise is that we also have to pay close attention to who has not been engaged, especially in a historical sense. And the data shows specifically that young people are requiring greater engagement. They want more transparency. They are raising their voices to say that we want to be part of the process. We also see the need to bring more diverse voices to the table, and that is going to look different in every community. But to be engaged, we have to cast a more inclusive, I think, approach to this work. And those are just the 2 points I would bring in, because certainly the data highlights the need for young people to be involved. And I think that is what a lot of organizations are saying. We'd like to do this, but we don't know how. And what we have often said is just start somewhere, start somewhere.
But I think what I would add, or one of the things I would add to both Allison and Una, is that historically there's been a perception within foundations that foundations should be behind the scenes. We should not be visible. We should let grantees get the credit for their work, and it's the grantees that are doing the work, and they should get the credit for that. But that sort of mindset of foundations being neither seen nor heard actually can interfere with some of the ways that foundations perhaps are perceived or are not perceived or not understood. And I also think that that foundations do think, to say foundations means a lot of different things in a lot of different ways and a lot of different types of engagements, a lot of different sizes. There are some foundations that their purpose is to write checks for park benches and band uniforms, and heavily oriented in a local geography, and sometimes blocks of geography rather than even cities or larger land masses. And of course, there are the multi-billion dollar, multi-tens of billions of dollar foundations in a couple of cases, that are out there that seem to get a lot more of the attention, a lot more of the notoriety as well. But when we talk about philanthropy, when we talk about foundations, it really is very different. And there's also some examples of foundations funding things, doing things that have dramatically impact our daily lives that are not necessarily understood. Some, and nonprofits in particular. Every day, people engage with nonprofits because they wear seatbelts, or because they have designated drivers, or because of pick some of these issues, and whether it's biomedical health devices or just safety, lines on the roads. That was it's just something we take for granted because we see it all the time, but that helps with driver safety. That was a foundation initiative, and small things like that. But it's large things like, and I'm going back 100 years now, but Guggenheim funding aeronautics. That leads to commercial air travel. It leads to the development of radar, which leads to the development of our ability to have a Zoom meeting, webinar like this. I don't expect people to connect those dots. I think that's acting too much. People in philanthropy, some of the world's experts in philanthropy, don't necessarily connect those types of dots, and that's okay. That's part of philanthropy and the sector operating from a place of humility, but also influence, and those are important.
Well, I think everything that you all have said leads to this big piece of the report, which is this focus on trust, and trust in the sector, and trust in nonprofits, and trust in philanthropy, and this interesting finding that trust in the sector is low, although we are more trusted than government and the private sector, and yet respondents have a high level of confidence in the ability of the philanthropic sector to solve problems. And so I'm very curious, Una, kind of what you make of that finding, that sort of seeming disconnect between the level of trust and the level of confidence. And then would also love to hear from others sort of how you match the findings of this survey around trust with findings from independent sectors, trust and civil society report, the Edelman Trust Barometer. How do all of those pieces and those findings play together for this in this bigger conversation?
So I can start, but would love to hear what others think as well. So when we talk about the trust overall, that question is framed, as you know, to do the right thing. And what you note is that we live in an era where there's just general distrust. And here in the United States, this has been tracked for at least the GSS data over time since the 1970s, and we've seen this downward trend. So I think that overall result is true for the United States. It's also true globally. And at the same time, we're working in an era of a lot of misinformation as well. And so you have this general growing distrust towards institutions, but also interpersonal trust is declining. So I think that's why you see that broad result. And that is certainly consistent with other research, not just by the Lilly Family School, but other institutions. Now, turning our attention to the confidence question, that's a slightly different question because it's really around solving problems. And what I would add there is that in the past few years, there's been a lot of conversation about philanthropy, but many have also seen the role that philanthropy played during the crisis. We saw in communities, large and small, community foundations, private foundations, even corporate foundations stepped up. Many of them expanded their portfolios, increased their payout rates, but also instituted flexible, unrestricted grants and worked really, I'd say, around the clock to engage with grassroots organizations on the front lines of the COVID crisis. So what we've seen is much more visibility around philanthropy. And when you talk about confidence in solving problems, everything from Dolly Parton's $1 million gift for COVID research to everyday donors that contributed, made masks, provided rides for their neighbors. So I think that also speaks to when we talk about the confidence that the American public has in the sector, that is back to getting the job done and the understanding that you need the flexible, nimble, agile role that philanthropy plays. In fact, we saw that very, I'd say in real time, played out in our own communities. The best example I often give is when schools were shut down. Here in Indianapolis, but around the country, many local donors stepped up to provide technology, laptops, tablets, devices so that students could start learning and transition from the classroom to virtual classrooms. And that was made possible by often local philanthropists working in communities. So that's just an example of the role that philanthropy can play, and back to that difference between trust and confidence, but relate two interrelated concepts. But I'll now turn it over to to Allison and John.
I'm happy to jump in. I was thinking more to the second part of the question about how all of our collective knowledge intersects. One of the things that was interesting, so Infinite Sector, we started fielding our trust research in 2019 with Edelman Data and Intelligence. And for many years, they did kind of a diagnostic model where it's like, they do this for profit companies all the time. Here's what you need to do as a sector to increase trust. And in their first study in 2019, they said, you need to be more visible. This is all what Una just said. You need to be more visible. People need to know that you're doing the work. They also said like getting endorsements from celebrities is really helpful, even though people won't tell you that directly. Showing that you're helping marginalized populations and low-income populations is really important. And then the pandemic hit. The sector actually did all of those things and was on the nightly news, and trust for a moment went up in the sector, and then it went back down again. And in my conversations with Edelman, I was a little frustrated because we did everything you told us, and why did it go back down? They said there was a bubble that burst, and their hypothesis at the time was, well, when we look at demographics, and I saw a question about, have you looked at sort of the variable of race? And we do every year. And basically what we found across all of the different variables, political parties, race, et cetera, all of the differences kind of disappear once you control for income and education, which also is consistent with Indiana University's study. So they said, well, we think maybe when people were feeling financially insecure, they started distrusting all institutions again. And the economics during the pandemic have been really volatile. But that also gets back to we were like, well, maybe this is a confidence question. So it's like, look, if I'm feeling insecure about the well-being, the financial well-being of my family, I don't trust any of you who claim you're helping me right now, was one hypothesis. What I will say is Edelman this year for their global barometer, which typically only surveys about 500 people in the US, which is why we work with them for a separate study just for the US to get a representative sample. But they started saying, well, maybe there are partisan divides. And I said, wait a minute, you've been telling us for 4 years there are not partisan divides. Explain yourself. And they said, oh, sorry. They don't think there are partisan divides, but it gets to Una and John's point about social divides and sort of othering of people, individual divides. They said, we actually think there may be a class divide that happens somewhere around the education and income space. So it may not be the financial security piece of that variable we were looking at. It may be more about, I don't think nonprofits or philanthropy are staffed or run by people who are like me and my family and my neighbors, and they don't understand what we need. And therefore I can't rely on them to try to help me and my community. So these are things that we're going to explore in our research this year. And we're adding a qualitative component just to dive a little deeper. But that we are seeing consistencies across studies that are giving us new research questions for us to explore, which I think are really helpful.
So one of the things that I would add to that, I mean, these studies and the results are, to me, a fascinating juxtaposition against some of the things that happen day to day. For instance, 10 years ago, I no more would have stood on a sidewalk and gotten in a stranger's car because they said they could take me where they just somebody pulling up to the curb. And I mean, Uber, Lyft, they are fundamentally based on trust. I mean, go back to, and I would go back to the founding of eBay and Pierre Omidyar's social experiment. Would people trust people to buy and deliver things online without knowing each other? And that proved a concept that people actually do trust strangers, each other, in a lot of common everyday interactions, which doesn't necessarily address I mean, it's a different question than the one of institutional trust and trust in institutions. But in some ways, there is a trust element in those day-to-day interactions that does have an institutional framework. I haven't quite put it together yet to see really what is that juxtaposition here. But I think that in some ways, and the study helps point this out. There's another juxtaposition, which is the lack of awareness and the lack of understanding. Why would there be high degrees of trust if people don't actually have an understanding? So the fact that the levels of trust maybe are as high as they are says something of itself. But Una talked about this, and Allison as well. It might have less to do with a moment in time and levels of trust and the trends. And those trends, I think, are an important aspect to this. And I would say the trends in trust, but I think the trends in decreases in individual giving and individuals giving of their money, giving of their time. And as those are decreasing, at least as they've been able to be identified within a a range of definition of philanthropy and charity. If it's limited to 501c3 giving, 501c3 donating, as opposed to some of the crowdfunding platforms, as opposed to some of the giving circles and mutual aid societies, and some of the other things that are out there that are indicators of generosity, and they are indicators of trust, that we do trust our neighbors to help us out when we need it. That doesn't necessarily get caught or reflected, certainly not in the same ways. But we still need, and as informal generosity seems to be growing, I still think we need the formal generosity to be at a high level as well, for some of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. And so finding ways to reverse the decreasing trends, while still allowing for the informal giving of the 5 T's to grow as well. I think they can be very complementary.
Great. Well, that is a really good segue into kind of my final area of questions, which is really about the notable shift in how generations are thinking about philanthropy and nonprofits and what they consider to be charitable giving. So the report really shows that the different ways that individuals can participate in philanthropy, which Una mentioned, around time, treasure, tithe, talent, and testimony. And there is this shifting perspective, it seems, between generations. So I'd love to just dig into that a little bit in our last 5 minutes and talk about how we see this perspective changing across generations, maybe why, and then what the implications are for philanthropy in the nonprofit sector. And maybe I'll start with you, Una.
Well, I just think that's a great point to kind of wrap us up here, because there's a lot of opportunity for innovation in the years ahead. Young Americans are gaining, I'd say, economic ground. They are obviously large in numbers, and they've grown up in an entirely different age with information at their fingertips. I think this is a moment where we need to meet those young people where they are. I feel like if there is one call to action, and usually researchers don't provide calls to action, but I do think the research points us in this direction, that we really need to make that a priority. That's true for funders, and that's true for nonprofits. We think about the pipeline of future donors, future volunteers, future community leaders. The young people are really where we need to be. And it's not necessarily going to be them adapting to our way of doing things. I think we also need to shift and adapt and learn some of that nuance and language. Trust is complex. And when you're working with young people, as you can see, their understanding is a lot broader. But I think the common thread from the research is the need for transparency and accountability. Young people want to often see the behind the scenes, how the organization is working, and it requires a lot more for organizations. But I also think the payoff is there, because those young people bring a lot of new perspectives, energy, enthusiasm. Working within higher education, I can certainly say that there's a lot to learn. So I'm here to sort of say, yes, that would be the takeaway from the data. Let's really try to understand, listen, and see how we can adapt our own models of engagement to ensure that they're inclusive, and inclusive certainly of young people, but also diverse voices across education and income divides, and also across racial and ethnic divides as well.
I think very well said, Una. The sector is not a monolith. It needs to not be a monolith. It needs to be inclusive, and I don't mean in a representative way. I mean in an engaging everybody kind of way, and that means that the sector, oddly enough, part of the sector's essence is that there must be room for people to disagree with each other. And that then leads to the pluralism. So, there needs to be room in the sector for people to, and organizations to have different points of view, and to even have conflicting points of view, civilly and appropriately stated and acted on. I do think that there's there's an aspect to giving and generosity, and especially as it relates to the health of the sector and the sector as in its role in our society, our government, vis-a-vis business, our political system, social systems, that there's a mindset aspect to it as well. And some of what I worry about with the younger generation, and some of how there are more opportunities to give, more opportunities to give money. I'm not sure all those opportunities to give money are the same as engagement, or the same as a mindset of belonging or increasing awareness. While point of sale, opportunities to give, rounding up to the next dollar when you're buying something, that can be helpful. It can be helpful in generating money for a cause or an organization. But is that really engagement? Is that a mindset that supports engagement with the sector in the same way? And maybe it is, and maybe it's just different. And maybe buying the fair trade coffee and paying more for it, it is a different mindset. It is a different way of thinking. Is it also engagement, though? And I think, there are some studies that talk about folks who do the point of sale, do the fair trade, et cetera, that they are actually more inclined to be giving in other ways as well. But I think that there are opportunities to better understand that as technology, and as the younger generation thinks differently, and thinking differently is not a bad thing. It's an opportunity. And can we understand that and bring it into engagement as well? Sorry, Allison.
No, I'm just so excited by what you said, and I'm going to build on it very quickly because I know we're at time.
You're at time, yep.
What I hear from you, John, is there's a difference between engagement and impact, right? And the data around young people actually is what encourages me along the impact aspect of the conversation and the unique value add of nonprofit sector institutions. That the fact that they see value in things like advocacy that require collective action, that's not something you can achieve by person-to-person giving. That means they're looking at bigger scale impact, and that's something we could only do together alongside other people, usually with some kind of organization through an institution, right? So that gives me hope. With all of the data that's out there that says, we have some too, that's like, younger people don't care about institutions in general, and we have data that says they're skeptical in trust, but the fact that they are looking to scale impact in lots of different ways makes me think there's an in for us, and we just have to figure out, to Una's point, of meeting them where they are.
That is a great high note to end us on, Allison. Thank you for getting us there. Thank you to all of our panelists, to John and Una and Allison, and thank you all for joining us today. And we hope to see you again later. Bye.